Hi everyone, welcome to our discussion on MOORS and BOERS Battles of the Bantu. This is part one. This is a throwback to our earlier discussions related to the Truth Commission. And so we are going to be revisiting the Truth Commission dynamics, and we're going to start off with this discussion about the MOORS and BOERS and the Battle of the Bantus. We're going to do this in brief portions, and so this is going to be a very short examination here, but we are going to touch on a few issues that I want you to hold on to solidify a paradigm. And so what I want you to keep in mind are these things, and they are on the screen. Black or white migration from Europe and or Asia does not change your biology or ancestry to original West African Bantu. And so, in other words, relocating to a Bantu ethno-linguistic land is not going to transform you into a Bantu. This is a message primarily for those on the west coast of Africa and for those who are in the Americas who are assuming this Bantu identity based upon a connection to West Africa, based upon a presumption that the people on the west coast of Africa now are the actual Bantu people. We're going to start off with this discussion from the New World Encyclopedia. And what it indicates is that Bantu is a general term for over 400 different ethnic groups in Africa. And this is from Cameroon to South Africa, Central Africa to Eastern Africa. And they are united by a common language family known as the Bantu languages. And the individuals within these language groups share many common customs. The question is how they spread throughout such a wide area. And so there have been many theories about this, but no consistent understanding about it. But the one thing I want you to keep in mind if you were paying attention is that you should have noticed that North Africa was not included in this ethnic group or these ethnic groups. Also, coastal West Africa was not included in the Bantu language groups. This is very important for our examination, and it's very important for your grasp of the totality of this situation that we've been dealing with and that we are currently dealing with. And so the Bantu are identified as a discrete group of people. Now, many people would have you believe that it includes all sorts of other groups of people, but it is a very discrete group of people, and it is understood as the people who have been identified on the screen. The reason it is important to examine and address this Bantu identity issue is because the Bantu identity has been taken from the Bantu and then superimposed onto the people of West Africa, by extension, some of the people in North Africa, and to a greater extent, the people in the United States and the Americas. This is coming from a presumption related to the original location of the Bantu, which was on the west coast of Africa. And what has happened is that people have taken the identity of the Bantu from them and put it onto other people. The reason why this is an issue is because there are certain assertions about some of the Bantu. There are certain beliefs about some of the Bantu related to their ancestry. And so there are certain assertions and certain beliefs that some of the Bantu are what would be considered the children of Jacob. And so this has created quite a bit of clamoring with respect to identity. But I want to point this out that simply putting on a prayer cloth, and we've talked about this before, and exercising a particular religion does not then transform someone into someone's child. And this applies whether you're talking about Jacob or any other man. This, for this purpose, applies to the children who are understood as Bantu, wherever they may be located. And this identity appropriation that some people have engaged in hopes of also taking on this identity that they believe belongs to the children of Jacob. This is not an assertion that the Bantu ethno-linguistic groups are the children of Jacob, but it is just to point out that that is an assumption that is made, and there have been dynamics that have taken place in relation to that. And so let's continue on. And if you go to the middle of the screen, we're going to continue with this reading. It indicates it is generally accepted that the Bantu-speaking peoples originated from West Africa about 4,000 years ago, although there is less consensus on the exact reason for and the course of their expansion. The reason for this confusion is that there were multiple migrations from West Africa, pushing the Bantu further into the south and further into the central area and further east. And part of this, it coincides with the transatlantic slave trade for one of the expansions. It coincides with some of the deportations out of Asia. It coincides with some of the jihads coming from the east. It coincides with some of the crusades coming from the north. And so you have a group of people who were persistently pushed south and east. And a large part of this had to do with accessing these trade routes and accessing the resources that are on the west coast of Africa. If you recall, you have the Gold Coast on the west coast of Africa. You had salt coming from the west coast of Africa. And the way they arranged it, they sold the Bantu people into slavery on the west coast of Africa. So there was a displacement and an enslavement. And as you know how removals work, when entities seek to remove people, a strange thing happens often. They remove them, they force them to go into a particular area that is not seen as beneficial. And when they get there, all of a sudden these resources pop up that the other people who pushed them into that region eventually seek to obtain. And so, of course, this occurred with the Bantu. Another thing to keep in mind is that the people in the Kalahari area are considered the original people of that South African region. And even though the Bantu are there, they are not considered the original people of that area. Their home is West Africa. Now, it's important that people keep in mind this dynamic because it can become very confusing. What took place was that the dark Asians, dark Eurasians, dark Europeans, and light Europeans in some instances took over that west coast of Africa. They, for the most part, deported the people, the original people from the west coast of Africa, into the south and into the central region. Some that they didn't deport, they enslaved. And so they destroyed entire villages and then ultimately would go into the places that they had pushed them and took them to be enslaved. When these individuals were pushed into the southern region of Africa, the central region of Africa, the people from Europe and the Arabian areas took over that west coast of Africa because, of course, they wanted that trade. That was clear. That's what they wanted, and that's what they established. And when you look at the maps, you see that that's what's on the west coast of Africa. It just gets confusing because people are used to thinking about Europeans in a particular light and thinking about Africans in a particular light. And so what it did was it created a great deal of confusion because the people on the west coast of Africa took on this identity as West Africans and participated in some dynamics similar to the ones that they did in the Americas, in the United States, with the indigenous people of America. And so took over some of their identities, took their lands, took their resources. And what it also looked like when you're talking about the west coast of Africa is that the original people in that land space were the ones selling people into slavery, when in fact they were the ones being sold into slavery. And this becomes more complicated because it wasn't just the resources that were desired, it was the identity that was desired. And you have matters complicated because the people who are the Bantu don't necessarily, at this point in time, because it's been so much time, they don't necessarily own that identity of being the original people on the west coast of Africa. And so it has freed up people on the west coast of Africa to take on that identity, and also to have people in the Americas do all sorts of things with respect to that identity, forgetting that the actual Bantu people are not the people, by and large, who are on the west coast of Africa. They are South and Central. But what has happened is you have a number of people in America taking on this West African ancestry identity, when in fact that's not really their identity. And if it is their identity and their biology is linking to those individuals, it's because those individuals are a part of a different ancestral line. And so those individuals who are on the west coast of Africa, by and large, are identified as Moor, regardless of what label they might be going by. And so if you have individuals in the Americas who have genetic traces to the people on the west coast of Africa, it's because that's the genetic trace. That's not the Bantu cluster that's in South and Central America. And so if an individual is Bantu, they should be showing an affinity for the individuals in South Africa, Central Africa, East Africa. Additionally, you have people in the United States who are identifying themselves as Hebrews or children of Jacob. They are identifying that way, but then simultaneously giving this label to people on the west coast of Africa because they feel this attachment to them. And so therefore, they will make all sorts of assertions about who the people on the west coast of Africa are, and then giving them an identity as Jacob's children based upon an assertion that they are the Bantu. When if the assertion is that the Bantu are Jacob's children, then the Bantu are in South, Central, and East Africa, and primarily not on that west coast of Africa. And so as we've discussed before with respect to individuals in America, we were looking at those pictures that are about 100 years old, it is not possible to simply put on a prayer shawl and then take on the identity of another group of people. And so this goes for the west coast of Africa also. And so it's not possible to simply put on a prayer shawl and then become the Bantu, or by extension become Jacob. There are many issues and complications with respect to this whole identity performance dynamic. But just to reiterate, even though an individual can take on a religious identity, they can wear a religious identity, it does not then give them a particular ancestry. And it has been noted that certain individuals believe that religion is sort of inherited. And so you will hear people talk about everyone being a particular religion, or their ancestors were a particular religion, and so therefore they are a particular religion. This is a very interesting construct, but ancestry doesn't exactly work that way. And so with respect to this particular dynamic, individuals may do all sorts of things in terms of performing a religious identity. However, it does not confer upon them that actual biological identity that they might believe goes along with the religion. Now, this discussion goes on to point out that the people who are in the Sahara area, the Sudan area, the Mandi people, the Fulani people, they speak a different language. They are from a different language family. And genetically, they are different people. They are not the same people as the Khoi people. They are not the same people as the Bantu people who went from West Africa into the central and southern areas. And so you had a very interesting thing that took place with respect to this Bantu migration. And so you have the individuals forcing them from West Africa into this South Central Eastern region. And then ultimately, after there was success there, those individuals were then confronted with the Boers. And so you had the Moors coming from the North and West Africa. And then after migrating into the southern area of Africa, they had to deal with the Boers, who then forced additional migrations on the same people. And so you have a dynamic of the Boers and the Moors interacting synergistically on the same group of people. And so the takeaways from this are these. One, the individuals on the west coast of Africa are not the indigenous people of the west coast of Africa by and large. The overwhelming majority of the people who were the original people on the west coast of Africa have been pushed out of that area. And you have some individuals who are still on that west coast of Africa, but they pretty much have been supplanted, and they have been usurped in terms of their own land space by the individuals who provided this dominant force coming from Europe and coming from Asia. Now, what's noteworthy about this dynamic coming out of Europe in particular, and it's the same thing when you talk about the Americas, you have these individuals who, according to the narrative, they were running from Inquisition, and then they were running because they were deported. And what stands out is that these individuals, although being deported, although being chased out of their own land, according to the narrative, they displayed no empathy for the people that they supplanted. And so they went into the west coast of Africa after this narrative about them being supplanted, and then proceeded to supplant the people on the west coast of Africa, and then pulled this same game on the east coast of America. And this dynamic might also help you to better understand why there are different health dynamics between individuals who are in the Americas, in the United States of America, and the west coast of Africa, and then the individuals who are in other parts of Africa. You have individuals who are in South Africa. If you just look at the current situation, you see that individuals in South Africa were having dynamics more similar to the dynamics going on in America than the dynamics between America and the west coast of Africa, or even the rest of Africa. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.